Hi everyone, my name is Rachel and I'm very excited to be giving a paper today entitled On Ocean and Earth I'm a Goodly Thing, The Ambiguous Lives of Eliza Cook's Poeticising Plants, focusing in particular on Cook's 1844 poem Song of the Seaweed. For a little author context, since I'm sure we're all jumping between all kinds of times and places today, Eliza Cook was born in London in 1812. She published a number of poetry collections, as well as publishing individual poems across a wide range of periodicals, before founding the weekly publication Eliza Cook's Journal in 1849, which outsold Dickens' Household Words in its first year. So, although she somewhat dropped off the critical radar today, Cook was one of the most well-known poets and journalists of her age. But what concerns me today are two poems written in a particular form that Cook kept coming back to over her career, and which Fabian Moyne, one of the few to analyse Cook's poetry in much detail, calls biographies of things. In these poems, readers follow a non-human protagonist through its natural life cycle, with several being autobiographies rather than biographies, in which the anthropomorphized speaker tells its own story, and I've put a few examples on the screen. By juxtaposing these last two poems, Song of the Hempseed and Song of the Seaweed, I'd like to explore the eco-Gothic potential of Song of the Seaweed, which has been overlooked in previous readings, which don't differentiate plant voices from other more conventional thing narratives, as in Moyne's list of autobiographies of a clock, a piece of charcoal, a goblet, a seaweed. And on reading this list, I think many of you will agree, the seaweed clunks, both in being the sole living item in a list of things, and also by the uncomfortable nature of its singular form. A seaweed always reads too much like a grammatical error. So I want to explore not only how the seaweed is given life in Cook's poem, but also how this difficult plurality of seaweed, this failure to render it singular and contained, functions poetically. Through this, I hope to move beyond seeing Eliza Cook as simply a purveyor of Chartist ideals or comfy, homely themes, a view created by the popularity of songs like The Old Armchair, possibly her most famous poem, which, as Caroline Mosley says, emphasised the security of the fireside, the warmth of maternal love, and the tranquillity of old times when life was, it seemed, less complicated. So to start with Song of the Hempseed. It is, of course, a land-based plant narrative, yet the Hempseed's poetic autobiography passes over its time as a plant, as a living and growing organism within the first few lines, and instead dwells on all the items it becomes after it's harvested, contentedly declaring, "Man shall carefully gather me up, his hand shall rule and my form shall change," by the fifth line. The plant speaker's various identities are therefore man-made and not its own. It exists only as rope to serve people aboard ships, as nooses for ringing church bells, lowering coffins, binding the harvest, and for fishing nets across the length of the poem. By giving the plant no identity or recognition of a life beyond these functions, the plant subject does indeed stay a thing. It is defined by and revels in its literal objectification, and any sense of discomfort that could be considered eco-Gothic is effectually quashed. No real otherness is permitted to enter the poem despite its non-human speaker, and the overall effect is pointedly anthropocentric. The plant seems to share human ideals, working towards the Chartist ideas of a goodly thing that the initial audience in the Northern Star would expect from the publication. In contrast, although Moyne puts the seaweed alongside all the other things in her list, Song of the Seaweed offers a different type of narrative. For all the closing stanzas, given in human voices, try to label the seaweed speaker another goodly thing by ending each of the closing three stanzas with the phrase, "the good seaweed." The seaweed song opposes and almost unwrites aspects of the Hempseed's verse, inviting an entangled reading of these two poems. First, the definition of life implicitly offered by these two autobiographies is entirely opposed. For the seaweed, the line, "Thou shalt be scattered abroad," betokens its demise, being burned for fertilizer, whereas the Hempseed's very first words are, "I, scatter me well." In other words, for the seaweed, life, and so the poem, ends when put to use by man, where the Hempseed paints this as its beginning. In fact, since the seaweed is gathered to quicken the grain of the earth, the seaweed song may even be the precursor to the Hempseed's life. Second, the attitude of the speaker to man. Where the Hempseed is entirely content to be ruled and changed by man, the seaweed evidently revels in its freedom and its autonomy. Human skill cannot bend me to its will. Third, although the seaweed emphasises its rope-like qualities and rich curling threads, and so echoes the hempseed's purposes and its fine threads curled, and even pointedly says it will match its tendrils to the halyard line of the ship it encounters, with such ropes, of course, often being made of hemp, one exists to save and the other to destroy. The seaweed that crept in Song of the Hempseed now seems to be telling its own story, one where the ship isn't saved by its strong ropes but is pulled down by nature's tendrils. In the Hempseed's verse, the wild tide is stemmed by the cable rope. In other words, the rope isn't allowed to fail and its saving powers are absolute. But in the Seaweed's verse, even though it echoes the rope wrapped around the wood of the ship in the same way, still I twine about the pine, here it's a scene of destruction. The mast is torn away and the ship sinks. The seaweed even refuses to be a saving rope for a drowning sailor and seems to mock the delusion that would lead the sailor to consider him as such. And if it is so opposed to and even undoes the hempseed's good works, then we have something more complex in the seaweed than the anthropocentrically good or useful plant. Here we have something more independent, more complex, and more ambivalent. The seaweed of this poem would therefore seem to have a discrete and certain identity. Although of course no human poet can know what a plant's perspective would be could it have one. As Keatley neatly summarises, plants exist on and beyond the outer limits of what we know. In going against the anthropocentric hempseed, Cook's Seaweed offers more than just a human point of view expressed by a plant puppet. As an eye in its own right, disagreeing and rewriting on an extra poetic level, it not only has uncanny powers of poetry, but it also refuses thingness. It refuses to be made into anything else, and even potentially molds the verse into its own natural physical form by making its shape apparent on the page. Not only is Song of the Seaweed divided by lines running through the text, reflecting the seaweed's uniquely fragmented and yet united form, unlike the Hempseed and Cook's other thing poems which don't do this, but also the poem's irregular line lengths and sporadic indentation cause the very words to undulate on the page with a mind of their own, in a manner my terrible screenshots are trying to suggest here. And this level of changeability is notably absent from other thing narratives like the Hempseed verse. With this selfhood in action comes an agency which Moyne, by classing the seaweed alongside other object narratives, overlooks. From her point of view, the seaweed changes direction according to the tides, and a storm at sea subsequently casts it ashore. In other words, tide and chance do most of the work. However, certain moments in Cook's poem give the seaweed far more agency. I break my slender hold gives the impression that the seaweed sets off of its own volition. It's active and not passive. The combative language in the opening stanza of power and trample and bend me to its will makes it seem like the seaweed is out to counter this aggressive human world. In some moments, it seems that the seaweed controls the sea rather than the reverse. It mounts its ocean steed and paints itself as a leader, not a passive entity. Even the moment of its being thrown on the shore, as Moyne describes, is depicted almost as a choice by the seaweed's voice. Rave on, ye waters, here I'll stay till storm and strife have passed away. When we can read the seaweed as rejecting the role of passive resource off the back of this evidence, it's tempting to cast it as an avenging monster, rebelling against mankind's uses and sneaking up on us from our blind spot. As Keatley has noted, perhaps the most obvious trope of plant horror is revenge, but if taken too far, this can undermine plants' threatening alterity by drawing them into a familiar and human narrative. This is why I would argue Song of the Seaweed is suited to eco-Gothic analysis, as the active revenge plot is only ever open to implication rather than being definitively stated, and thus isn't so absolute as to render the plant non-other. The result is that the passive reading exemplified by Moyne and the active reading I've just sketched out can coexist due to the poem's pointed ambivalence. Let's take these two moments for an example. Narrating the sinking of the ship, Cook's Seaweed declares, "Still I twine about the pine till a wild and bursting cry tells the fearful work is done. The ship leaps up, the mast is gone, and away with it go I." The agency is indefinite here. Is the seaweed carried off by the mast, and goes away with it, or does it bear the mast off triumphant? Both readings can coexist. The episode with the drowning sailor has a similar effect, describing, "While I mingle with the wreath of white foam gurgling through his teeth and twist and tangle in his locks." It raises the question, is it carried there by the sea, or is it again binding and choking and strangling him as it may have done the ship? The result of this ambivalence is the coexistence of both possibilities, allowing the plant to remain threatening and monstrous should we wish to read it as such, without being totally within the realms of a human understanding. It remains ungraspable, rather than confined to the easily comprehensible revenge plot, thereby avoiding doing violence to its obscurity while still allowing it to be threatening. The question of boundaries is always essential to a text's Gothic effects. The assorted humans of the poem view the seaweed as a series of objects, much like the hempseed before it. It's treated as a rope by the drowning sailor, a pretty decorative object by the foraging child, and as fertilizer by the seaweed gatherers who finally end the poem. As such, the human's perspective hinges upon entirely discrete notions of us and them, human and plant. Yet on top of the entanglement of these two poems and of the two potential active and passive readings that we've already explored, the poem as a whole also blurs the boundaries between the plant and the human, exploiting the liminal potential of the coastal setting. The obvious way in which the seaweed encroaches upon the bodily boundaries of the drowning sailor on a very literal level, threatening to invade his throat or stomach, is one of the most viscerally unsettling moments of the poem. Yet it also serves to draw attention to the ways in which plants and humans infiltrate each other across their different life cycles, enmeshed within a cyclical food chain. Cook highlights their shared mortality by depicting men and plants both dying alike from lack of water despite being surrounded by it, through the sailors madly calling for rain aboard ship, and the seaweed shrivelling up on the beach within 20 lines of each other. We don't hear what happens to the sailors, but the seaweed is then collected and burned for fertilizer to spread on the fields, to nourish the food humankind will eat. Yet both humans and seaweed alike, as Cook points out in her Memento Mori-style conclusion, will end up as dust in the fields for the new crop. Prince and pilgrim and tiller are all in the same boat as the seaweed. The result is a glimpse of a world in which plants and humans are continually feeding off each other, like the vampirically frantic men aboard ship thinking of a messmate's open vein, with all living things drawing life from the organisms around them in one way or another. This not only awakens an existential fear in encapsulating Keatley's description of how plants embody mortality, we all become sustenance for plants, ashes to ashes, as she points out. Cook's reader is also left to come full cycle in the boundary-blurring field of horror, and realise that the seaweed, used to fertilise the very grain we eat, is already within us. Unlike the sailor, we have already swallowed it. Blurring yet more boundaries, with each side equally culpable for doing harm to the other, as this cycle of consumption indicates, if we do read into the poem that we have a monstrous, vengeful plant on our hands, we're also forced to conclude that the humans are no better. Agnes Schrerer defines the typical monster plant as one that grows rapidly, often menacingly so. It walks around and chases its human victims with snatching arms like a predator. It often sucks their blood or eats them, and sometimes it even wants to merge with the human body. Yet the humans of the poem, disconcertingly, fit equally well into these criteria. We see that it grows rapidly in that only the children admire or want to play with the seaweed. The adults are more sinister, giving the sense that childish harmlessness is short-lived. As we've seen, only mankind expresses a desire to suck blood in the poem and wants to merge with the plant body by carrying it off as fertilizer. And finally, the poem abounds with snatching human arms clutching at the very seaweed whose perspective the reader is sharing. The drowning man has a wildly snatching hold. The foraging child wants to bear it away and stretches to reach it. And finally, the seaweed meeteth the hand of the beachcombers, who gather and carry it away. Thus viewing humans from the outside, through the seaweed's eyes, if you like, thanks to the poem's first-person presentation, it is the people that are in danger of becoming the monstrous other, a mirror image to the monstrous plant. This is not the end of the implication of the readers in the seaweed's world, or the process of becoming seaweed, if you like, that Cook's poem offers. As Keatley notes, media offers scant calls to take a plant's point of view in general, but from the Song of the Seaweed's opening words, I am born, that is exactly what Cook has offered, and through sharing the seaweed's adventures and perspective, readers also have the option to share its opinion of humankind and of the world. As a result, I would disagree with Moyne that, in the end, the thoughtless seaweed gradually learns that its self-sacrificing duty is more meaningful than its playful and selfish existence, and simply sacrifices itself for an unquestionable social good. Rather, having identified with it for so long, we cannot hear the seaweed's death dirge without mourning its loss, an act which separates the reader from the humans within the poem, who take the seaweed's death as the theme of our chanting mirth. They may refuse to name and to mourn because they do not see its independent value, having not heard its voice or its story, but we, the reader, cannot do so, having been cured of our plant blindness to see humanity from the outside. Thus, the reader may come to recognise that they're not entirely on the human side anymore, but have become entangled in other perspectives and other sympathies, closer to the plant than the human. Plant morality or values too seem to win the day. I started by asking what makes a plant a goodly thing, and showing how the Hempseed's poem left the reader certain. Yet where Moyne argues that the seaweed experiences moral evolution, i.e. attains the human point of view which is inherently anthropocentric, I hope I have shown that the human sense of good, i.e. useful, seems worth very little by the end of Song of the Seaweed, particularly when the seaweed is only called good by those with no understanding of its story and who wish to exploit it for their own ends. As a result, we end with no idea what a goodly thing really is or does. We end with ambivalence and a self entangled in both plant and human values. As a parting thought, even before its supposed moral evolution at the close, the seaweed gives a human child a moral to contemplate. As he fails to catch it on the beach, the seaweed says, I am gone, my fair boy, I am gone and for ever. Thou wilt covet full many bright things, but take heed they elude not your grasp like the pretty seaweed. This particular moment, in which the seaweed constructs its own meaning and one the human cannot see, makes the loss of the seaweed's voice at the close of its poem all the more poignant. Its own moral to its own tale never comes, and much as I do like to wonder what that might have been if human voices hadn't taken over the song with their unknown music, perhaps Cook leaves us, the reader, to supply this plant perspective for ourselves, confident there is now at least as much of the seaweed spirit in us as the human. Thank you for watching.